The sound of the basilica's bells echoed over the ancient rooftops of Rome as Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the official car. The crowd gathered outside St. Peter's Square did not know what to expect. The visit of an African leader to the Vatican had always been a diplomatic event, but on that day, the air carried an unusual tension. The camera slowly zooms in, focusing on Traoré's face, serene, yet resolute. He was not wearing the expected Western suit. Instead, he wore a traditional Burkina Faso tunic, pure white, contrasting with the black marble floor at the entrance to the Holy See. It was as if he carried within him the voices of millennia. This was not merely a meeting between two heads of state. It was a silent duel between opposing worldviews. The Vatican corridors were as quiet as tombs. Swiss guards stared at Traoré without emotion, but he knew how to read their eyes. He saw distrust, fear, and even repulsion hidden behind their ceremonial spears. And yet, he walked. His steps echoed like drumbeats, measured, slow, reminding all that each stride was the fruit of a long history of colonization, resistance, and dignity. The papal audience chamber opened slowly. Pope Leo XIV, with his impassive face, awaited him seated on a throne of carved wood, adorned with gold. He was a tall man, with cold features and blue eyes so piercing they seemed to cut through the soul. But Traoré did not avert his gaze. He bowed slightly, out of courtesy, not submission, and then stood fully upright. "Ibrahim Traoré," the Pope began, his tone carefully measured. "Your deeds are known around the world, but your presence here today is surprising." Traoré remained silent for a brief moment. His gaze swept the room. Ancient tapestries, golden crucifixes, old books on marble tables. Then, he turned back to the Pope. "I came because there are things that can only be said face to face, Your Holiness." The silence stretched, sharp. The Pope raised an eyebrow, as if preparing to steer the conversation. But he had no time. "Your church," Traoré said slowly, "was present in my land even before my freedom. I grew up hearing the name of Christ, but I also saw crucifixes used to justify invasions. I saw missionaries bring faith, and then wealth. I saw churches rise beside gold mines, from which my people emerged empty-handed." His words fell like hammer blows upon the golden silence of the hall. A bishop beside the Pope shifted uncomfortably, but Leo XIV did not blink. Still, something in his expression hardened. "Have you come to accuse me?" he said, his voice calm but laden with tension. Traoré smiled lightly, a smile that sought neither permission nor forgiveness. "I came to bring truths that do not fit within diplomacy." The Pope then stood. The air in the room grew heavier. The camera slowly circles, creating a rotating effect around the two leaders. The world watched from afar, but there, at the heart of the oldest religious power on earth, two spiritual forces collided. The Pope walked toward Traoré, stopping less than a meter away. "Do you know what concerns me, Mr. Traoré?" he said, his tone now darker. "It is this attempt of yours to spiritualize rebellion, to turn a people's struggle into a moral crusade. Faith requires order. It requires hierarchy. You have become dangerous because you inspire people to believe they can break with that." Traoré did not respond immediately. He took a deep breath. His eyes glistened briefly, not with fear, but with weight. The weight of an entire people on his shoulders. Then he spoke. "I am the son of a woman who washed clothes in the river. I saw my father die without a doctor because the mission hospital denied us entry. I know the smell of dry earth when hunger strikes. And yet, even so, we prayed, and God answered us. Without priests, without cathedrals, only with faith. Is that dangerous?" The Pope swallowed hard. The camera focuses on his hands, previously still, now trembling on the golden scepter. For the first time, the silence belonged not to him, but to the one who had seized control of the scene. Traoré stepped closer, a risky move. A Swiss guard took a step forward, but the Pope raised his hand, allowing the African to speak. "I did not come here to beg for acceptance. I came to remind the world that justice does not ask for permission, and that God has no owner. Faith does not belong to the Vatican. It was born in the deserts. It wept in the mountains, and it is resurrected today in the streets of Africa. Your Holiness may call me a rebel, But my people, they call me Hope." The words hung in the air like a sentence of revelation. The Pope took a step back. He sat down. The room, once imposing, now seemed smaller. Smaller before a man who needed no throne to be a king. A man with feet firmly on the ground and eyes turned to the heavens. The official visit would end there, but there would be no traditional handshake, no ceremonial photo. The image that would flood newspapers and social media was of Traoré leaving in silence, his white tunic gently swaying in the morning breeze, as a cloud obscured part of St. Peter's dome, as if the sky, for a moment, also fell silent. Outside the walls, something even more striking was happening. Hundreds of African expatriates gathered, emotional, at the entrance to the square. They had come from all corners of Europe. Some held Burkina Faso flags, others carried signs with phrases like, "Justice is faith in action," and "Traoré, our prophet of the new generation." When he appeared, there were no shouts. There was silence, a silence of respect, of reverence. Some fell to their knees. Others wept openly. It was like watching Moses descend from the mountain, not with tablets, but with eyes that had seen the invisible and returned transformed. The video of that silent encounter between Ibrahim Traoré and Pope Leo XIV was released by only one independent African channel. But in less than 48 hours, it surpassed 50 million views. There was no narration, no subtitles, just the raw sequence of looks, gestures, and spiritual tension between two worlds. It was like watching an invisible battle waged with words, silences, and truth. Across the African continent, entire churches interrupted their liturgies to project the video. In schools and universities, young people stood to applaud the moment when Traoré said, "God has no owner." It was as if, for a moment, every African forgot the weight of the day and felt pride in their own skin, their language, their history. But within the Vatican corridors, the atmosphere was different. A Spanish archbishop named Varela, influential in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, urged the Pope to issue an immediate theological response, condemning Traoré's doctrinal arrogance. More cautious cardinals reminded him that the public reaction had been massive and that openly condemning the African president could spark a diplomatic crisis. Leo XIV, however, remained silent. He spent his days in secluded prayer, replaying the words of the man who did not bow, who did not apologize, who spoke with the voice of millions. Meanwhile, Traoré had returned to Ouagadougou. But something was different. In the weeks that followed, his presence was sought by religious leaders, not only Muslims or Protestants, but even African Catholic priests who came discreetly to his office. They sought not just political audience, but solace, direction, identity. One priest, an old and stooped man named Isidore, looked at him with tearful eyes. "For many years, I knelt before the altar and still felt small when I looked to Rome. But seeing you, I finally understood that God also speaks with an African voice." The words echoed within Traoré like sacred thunder. He remained silent, but then took the priest's hand. There was no longer a divide between throne and altar. In that moment, they were simply children of the same Father. Days later, an unexpected invitation arrived at the presidential office. It was signed by Pope Leo XIV himself. In it, the pontiff asked Traoré to consider returning to the Vatican. But this time, not for a closed audience. The invitation was to participate in a public session inside St. Peter's Basilica before world leaders to discuss faith, justice, and reconciliation. The world stopped. The next scene seemed straight out of a prophetic film. The central nave of the basilica, with its golden mosaics and towering columns, was packed. Representatives from 60 countries had accepted the invitation. But the world's eyes were fixed on two men, Pope Leo XIV, in his white vestments and pensive expression, and Ibrahim Traoré, once again in his African tunic, this time a deep blue adorned with traditional golden embroidered symbols. Silence hung like an invisible dome over all, until the Pope stood and, to everyone's astonishment, yielded the pulpit to Traoré. A gesture even the oldest cardinals did not expect. It was like watching Caesar offer the throne to a peasant, and the peasant accepting without arrogance. Traoré walked to the center of the altar, looked at the faces gathered there, and began to speak. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. It was the voice of a shepherd of souls, not a politician, and his words were fire and balm at once. I did not come here to accuse. I came to remind that the cross was not made to hang gold, but to recall those who bled for justice, to remind that faith is born in pain but flourishes in forgiveness, and that the Christ who washed feet wore no golden crown. An Italian cardinal discreetly wiped a tear, a Congolese bishop knelt at the end of the pew, and even the Pope's face, for a moment, seemed more human. When I was a boy, Traoré continued, I saw my mother share the little we had with a European missionary. She said he brought the word of God, and he did. But I grew up and realized that God did not come from Europe. God was there all along, by our side. When my mother prayed in her ancestral tongue, God heard. When the drums beat in the night, God heard. When women danced around the fire, weeping for their lost children, God heard. Emotion filled the space. For the first time in centuries, St. Peter's Basilica seemed to breathe a truth not written in books, but etched in hearts. Your Holiness, Traoré said, now turning to the Pope, you called me here to speak of reconciliation. But reconciliation begins with truth, and truth sometimes wounds, but it heals. So I do not expect applause. I only ask that you and everyone here listen, not with your ears, but with your soul. Leo XIV stood. He walked to the pulpit. Everyone held their breath. Then, to the astonishment of all, he knelt before Traoré, not as a political act, but as a silent confession. He lowered his head. The cameras trembled. Reporters forgot their scripts. History was being rewritten before them. Traoré hesitated for a second. Then he extended his hand and lifted the Pope. It was a simple gesture, but laden with symbolism. There was no victor or vanquished. There were two men broken by truth and rebuilt by faith. At the ceremony's end, there were no formal speeches. Only an ancestral African song echoed through the basilica's columns, sung by a choir of young Burkinabé specially invited. It was a song of land, blood, seed, and hope. Outside, an American journalist approached Traoré and asked, Mr. President, what do you believe changed today? He looked at her with the same calm, profound gaze as always, and replied, Perhaps, today the heavens came a little closer to the earth. The video of the moment when Pope Leo XIV knelt before Ibrahim Traoré not only broke millennial protocols, it broke the internet. Within hours, it became the most shared video in social media history, surpassing records of coronations, wars, and even World Cup finals. But more than likes, views, or headlines, that silent gesture sowed something no institution had yet achieved. True reconciliation between the spiritual and the historical, between the center and the periphery, between those who speak loudly and those who have always been silenced. In Africa, crowds took to the streets in spontaneous celebrations. In Burkina Faso, young people formed a human chain from the presidential palace to the Ouagadougou Cathedral, praying together, singing together, dancing in honor of a people's restored dignity. In Rwanda, a Protestant pastor and a Catholic priest swapped pulpits during a symbolic service. In Kinshasa, Muslim leaders joined an open-air mass where the Roman liturgy was not read, but Psalm 126 was, Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. But it was not only in Africa. In the peripheral neighborhoods of Paris, London, and New York, children of black immigrants wept before their screens. Not because they saw a president, but because they saw a man like their fathers, their uncles, their grandparents, with simple clothes, strong roots, and heads held high before the world. And Traoré? He did not return home on a presidential plane. Discreetly, he chose a regular commercial flight. Disguised under a cap and dark glasses, he sat among ordinary workers and African students in economy class. A Malian woman recognized him mid-flight and began to cry. He embraced her as if she were his own mother. Another young man, shyly, handed him a wooden rosary saying, I carried this to the desert, and God heard me. Now it's yours. Traoré accepted it with both hands, kissed it, and tucked it into his chest pocket, close to his heart. Arriving in Burkina Faso, He was received without pomp. No military parade, no press conference, just a group of children waiting at the palace entrance, with handmade signs. "Thank you for making us dream." One of them, a little girl with big eyes and neatly done braids, approached and asked, "President, does God live here too?" The question disarmed him. He knelt before her, looked into her eyes and answered, "God lives where there is truth, and if there is truth here, then he never left." Traoré entered the palace and went straight to the simplest room, the one where he received grieving mothers, indebted farmers, orphans, pastors, and elderly chiefs. He sat alone. He said not a word. He simply closed his eyes and prayed in silence. A prayer without words, without requests, only gratitude and tears. That night before sleeping he wrote in his diary, "Today I defeated no one. I merely brushed the dust off the feet of an ancient history crying for redemption. And if tomorrow I fall, may my fall remind men that justice is stronger than power, and that the kingdom of God begins where truth meets courage." Pope Leo XIV, for his part, did not return to the throne with the same hauteur. In the days that followed, he began discreet reforms. He opened dialogue with marginalized Christian communities. He personally visited the poorest neighborhood in Rome, where he embraced the sick and washed the feet of refugees. No one filmed it. There were no spotlights. But something had changed. The stone cathedral had finally found a living altar. Some say Traoré and the Pope continued to correspond in secret letters, that they exchanged prayers, poems, confessions, that they became brothers in spirit, despite being so different in the world. Others say it was just a political, strategic, staged gesture. But those who were there, who saw Traoré's rock-steady gaze and the Pope's, broken like a clay vessel, know it was more than politics. It was a miracle. Time passed. The video gave way to new scandals, new wars, new games. But somewhere in the world, someone always rediscovers it. A young man in an unjust prison cell, a woman who lost her son to violence, a hungry and frightened boy, an old man abandoned on a corner. They see that moment, and something ignites, not hope for victory, but for dignity. Because Ibrahim Traoré did not kneel to be worshipped, nor did Pope Leo XIV bow out of weakness. Both knew that true power lies not in those who command, but in those who love, and that sometimes the greatest strength is in the act of lowering oneself to lift another. And that is why, even today, even without knowing where the full video is, or how to pronounce the name of that African president in the white tunic, many still say, "I don't remember his name, but I remember what I felt when I saw that man make the world bow to the truth." And that will never be forgotten.